as Rousseau winds this argument to its conclusion, he talks about our natural love of freedom, which really rebels against the situation of inequality. Man's natural dispositions for or against servitude must therefore not be judged by the degradation of enslaved peoples, but by the prodigious feats of all free peoples to protect themselves against oppression. This is on page 187. He's responding to the folks who say, oh, Rousseau, but everybody lives in this society, everybody lives in this under a government, and they're not fighting against the government. They're not fighting against the situation. Why not? And he says, don't judge people by the corrupt, perverted populace that is docile about inequality and desires wealth. Show the examples of people who risk their lives to protect their freedom, who risk their lives to protect their equality. Or he says even go to the zoo and see how animals just hate captivity. And he uses the example of an animal that smashes its head against the bars of the cage because it can't stand not being free. Now, we have gotten used to our unfreedom, and that is not a sign that unfreedom is natural or that our situation is natural. It's a sign that we have become perverted and our natural love of freedom is disappearing. A sign of this perversion for Rousseau is that rich people, he says, are happy because of the existence of the poor. That the wealth itself doesn't mean that much to them, but what means something to them is that they can look at other people and feel superior to them. So this is towards the end, page 195. If one sees a handful of powerful and rich men at the pinnacle of greatness and fortune, while the masses crawl in obscurity and misery, it is because the former value the things they enjoy only to the extent that the others, the poor, are deprived of them. And they would cease to be happy if, without any change in their own state, the people cease to be miserable. That is, it's seeing the misery of other people which gives the wealthy people a sense of satisfaction. So he was invited to a party, and the entertainment at the end of the party was that a huge banquet. Everybody has these tables laden with food too big for their eyes, too large for their appetites. So afterwards, all the aristocrats go outside and they see the peasants who are living at the edge of starvation, and they take bread and they just throw the bread at the peasants and watch them scramble and try to grab it. That was amusing. And Rousseau's, then he writes, I can't believe I was there. I am such a hypocrite. I am such an awful person. Let me tell you about it, reader. And he says, why do these people behave this way? They're richer people, after all. Why do they behave this way? Because they only like having that much food because the other people are starving. Because nobody really likes this stuff they're eating. They don't like it that much. They learn to like it because they say, well, I can eat this and those people can't. And for Rousseau, this is a great sign, awful sign of our corruption. And that leads to what for him is this existential situation where we live outside of ourselves. The genuine cause of all these differences is that the savage man lives in himself. Sociable man, Rousseau writes, always outside himself. The sociable man is capable of living only in the opinion of others, and so to speak, derives the sentiment of his own existence solely from their judgment. He's critiquing the rich for their sadism, really, in getting satisfaction from the existence of poverty, but he's critiquing the whole society for creating the conditions for vanity and hypocrisy so that we live outside ourselves. We want to be seen in a certain way by other people. It is manifestly against the law of nature, however defined, that a child command an old man, an imbecile lead a wise man, and a handful of people abound in superfluities, while the starving multitude lacks the necessities. This is for him against the law of nature. The society he lives in. Remember, a society still built on divine right of kings, a society built on this kind of baked-in natural, they called natural inequality. Rousseau says, this whole society is illegitimate because it's a violation of who we are as human beings, that the imbecile leads the rest. That's pretty damning, and you can see why Rousseau was shocking writer to the society around him. I want to pull this to a close by just giving you some reactions to Rousseau, just starting off with Voltaire, who read Rousseau and sent him a letter after reading the second discourse, which enraged Rousseau. You'll see why. Voltaire writes, "I have received, sir, your new book against the human species." Okay, your new book against the human species. And I thank you for it. No one has ever been so witty as you are in trying to turn us into brutes. To read your book makes one long to go on all fours. Since, however, it is now some 60 years since I gave up that practice, I feel it is unfortunately impossible for me to resume it. I leave this natural habit to those more fit for it than you or I. In other words, Voltaire is saying, come on, Rousseau, we don't go back to being children or the youth of the world. We don't go back to crawling around on all fours. Don't show us that we're brutes. Voltaire is thinking Rousseau, who calls us hypocrites, is himself being hypocritical. And Rousseau is outraged, and you can read his reactions to Voltaire, who he hated deeply after this encounter. Others later, after Rousseau's death, will take Rousseau as having shown them the true way for true freedom. And the scariest of this, perhaps one of the most important, happens in the French Revolution during the Reign of Terror, when Robespierre, who was called the incorruptible, Robespierre led the Committee on Public Safety and said, we have to stamp out inequality. We have to create virtue through equality. And that meant, virtue through equality meant you kill the people who are standing out. You execute the people who are different. To create homogeneity, to create equality, which meant for Robespierre to create virtue. Now, Rousseau didn't say to do this, but Robespierre thought this was the lesson from Rousseau, a kind of what would later be called totalitarianism, what Hegel called the pursuit of absolute freedom through violence. Robespierre wrote, "What is the end of our revolution? The tranquil enjoyment of freedom and equality, the reign of that eternal justice, the laws of which are graven not on the marble or stone, but in the hearts of men, even in the heart of the slave who has forgotten them, and in that of the tyrant who disowns them. We wish, in a word, to fulfill the intentions of nature." Notice the Rousseauian language. "And the destiny of man. We wish to realize the promises of philosophy and acquit Providence of a long reign of crime and tyranny. That France, once illustrious among enslaved nations, may, by eclipsing the glory of all free countries that have ever existed, become a model to the nations." That's what they want. That's what Robespierre wants. "A terror to oppressors and a consolation to the oppressed. That is our ambition. We'll seal the work with our blood," Robespierre says. So he is inspired by Rousseau to institute, through the Committee on Public Safety, what becomes known, of course, as the Reign of Terror. Now, I'm not saying, I want to be clear, that this is Rousseau's responsibility or that this is a correct reading of Rousseau. But Rousseau did inspire strong reactions and continues to do so. So I'll give you another reaction to Rousseau, this one by Edmund Burke, whose Reflections on the Revolution in France is a hallmark of conservative thinking. For Burke, Rousseau was evil because he offered a theoretical notion of freedom, that is, a freedom that was conceptually pure and therefore would be imposed on a people by intellectuals or by rulers who thought they were following a recipe or a theory. For Burke, this was the great error of the French Revolution, that they were inspired, that the revolutionaries thought they could change the world through ideas that they put into practice, rather than seeing how politics should emerge organically through the lives of a society, through the developments of a culture. For Burke, politics could not be theoretical without becoming violent and cruel. And Rousseau, Burke thought, offered a theory of politics when what you really wanted to have was an organic development of the political that was in sync with religion, with habit, with custom,
and with aspirations for change. Later in the 19th century, Tocqueville, another thinker often used in conservative circles, Tocqueville wrote in the Old Regime and the Revolution that the French people were guided by two major principles, that is the desire for equality and the desire for freedom. And for Tocqueville, the history of France was the history of trying to reconcile these two desires, one for equality and one for freedom. And so for Tocqueville, the urge for equality led to tyranny. So he thought that, against Rousseau, that when you try to institute equality, what you realize is you need a stronger and stronger government to institute the equality. Now, Rousseau thought the government was there to promote inequality. And Tocqueville reverses this and says, well, actually, what we need now, if we're going to have more equality, which the French people sometimes seem to want in the 19th century with this obstinate zeal, he says, that you would need a strong government to redistribute wealth, and you need despotism to institute equality. This is against the legacy of Rousseau that Tocqueville is writing. And finally, I thought it'd end again with another conservative thinker. We don't read too many conservative thinkers, or I should say these are thinkers who are used by conservatives. They're actually maybe not themselves conservative thinkers, but Leo Strauss, who's a German and American political theorist, writes in Natural Right and History that Rousseau's thesis that man is by nature good must be understood in the light of his contention that man is by nature subhuman. Man is by nature good because he is by nature that subhuman being which is capable of becoming either good or bad. There is no natural constitution of man to speak of in Rousseau. Man is by nature almost infinitely perfectible. So what Strauss sees in Rousseau is that the concept of nature in Rousseau is one that already has kind of historical prejudices built into it, so that for Rousseau, we are perfectible creatures and corruptible ones. And that is not the same as figuring on a stable concept of nature, because Rousseau's natural human, as Strauss says, is subhuman or proto-human, and that is, he is going to change. He is capable of perfectibility or of corruption, and that the error for Strauss sees in Rousseau is that thinking you have a natural standard when what you really have is a framework for thinking about how human beings will change, rather than a standard that allows you to judge human actions. So Rousseau's legacy is long and it's deep. He institutes a mode of thinking that challenges his contemporary society by saying that the dynamics that we see in what looks like progress are really corruption, that we see greater inequality protected by the state, that vanity and hypocrisy keep us from knowing what human beings are really like. And that is key for us as we move through the course. For Rousseau, the really real is this notion of human beings as having these two principles prior to reason, the principle of self-preservation, the principle of pity, and that is the core of his thinking. And when he looks around him in the 18th century, he says, I don't see these principles at work. They're hidden beneath layers of hypocrisy, layers of vanity. And Rousseau, as a modern thinker, says, where is the real human beings in modernity? I'm looking around here and I see somebody who thinks he's a baker. I see someone who thinks he's an aristocrat. I see someone who thinks he's a politician. I see another person who thinks he's smarter than everybody else. But where are they? Where are the real human beings in there? What I see are layers and layers of corruption, that is, layers of acting for other people. I, Rousseau, want to strip away those things to see what people really are. And he looks around and sees that, and then he also sees that everything that people are celebrating as modern and progressive in his culture, those are the things that are leading to more and more vanity and hypocrisy. So Rousseau's uses the modern tools of the Enlightenment to see through this hypocrisy, but he also turns against modernity and the Enlightenment in calling for an end to this, what he thinks of as modernity's pursuit of vanity.
and its pursuit of luxury and inequality. We'll see next time in Marx that the critique of inequality in the 19th century accelerates as thinkers begin to try to understand not just how we pretend to be for others, how we act for others, but they try to understand the new conditions of labor, the new conditions of work that come along with the Industrial Revolution. Rousseau is there at the cusp, just before the Industrial Revolution kicks in, but at a point when modernity is beginning to define itself. We'll see as we move through the course that taking into account industrialization and the development of the modern city will be the task that our subsequent thinkers take on. We'll see you then.